fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCO 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. Mr. David Karate Martino is here.
I am here. How you doing?
Oh, you good? You got what happened? You got the weekend. You did all that kung fu and stuff, eh?
14 hours of stick fighting and all that stuff.
Sounds like something I would. No, that's something I do, but different. Wow. But that's crazy. That's great. And you got some sort of I see certificate that you're putting all over the internet.
Oh yeah. Well, I got, we get a certificate for doing the 14-hour training, and I got my first level in the system that this one teacher teaches.
Oh, is that like one of those, they give an award to everybody?
Yeah. Well, the certificate for being there. But yeah, you can go up and basically you're testing for your first ranking.
Yeah.
Within a system.
So everybody gets an award.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, why not? Well, today we are going to talk true crime, and we're going to talk about the man with a killer smile. And it's the life and crimes of a serial mass murderer, Volume 13 of the North Texas Crime and Criminal Justice Series. So it sounds like something you've done. So, well, anyway, let's welcome Mitchel P. Roth to the show.
Thank you.
Mitch, so what's going on here? You've been writing about this serial killer. How did you come across this story?
Well, that's the more interesting element to it. About 25 years ago or 20 years ago, I was teaching a class on serial homicide and mass murder. And I had a student tell me that he was related to the fifth white person electrocuted in Texas, who was also a mass murderer and a serial killer. And, I told him, congratulations. He won the Nobel Prize. So anyway, I said, do you have any family papers or documents, which I usually will do? And he said, well, actually, we do have some research that we've compiled. And I said, can you make me a copy of it? And this is a long time ago. And so he did that for me. He actually made a copy, and I've held on to it for like 20 years, waiting for, in between books that I was working on at the perfect time. And, and this was kind of my pathway to doing the research, which I started right before the epidemic started. I went up to the Panhandle of Texas and to a courthouse and got the trial transcripts and visited all the places from the crime spree. And fortunately, I was able to write it over the COVID break. So a lot of serendipity there. And and I think that the most important element of it is no one's ever written about this guy. I mean, he's not in any of the compendiums by Harold Schechter or anybody else of mass murder and serial killers. And yet he killed 13 people over a 9-year period. And, I've kind of added him or reinvigorated him, returned him to his proper place among the degenerates of the world.
Well, it was nice of you. Well, I wonder why nobody's really caught him before. I guess just not heard of him.
Well, I think because of where it took place. It took place, out in the high plains, near Clovis, New Mexico, very sparsely populated, not a lot of newspapers and that sort of thing. It was covered pretty heavily at the time, but there were some other murder cases going on in the 1920s that, basically, got most of the coverage. And I think part of it too is it took a while for them to discover that he had committed a mass murder 9 years earlier, and that wasn't until right before he was executed. And so, he might be part of the DNA of that area up in the Panhandle, but, nobody else really is that familiar with it.
Wow. So what's the basic premise of this? Now, first of all, this was back in the 1920s?
Right. He was caught in 1926 and executed in 1928.
Wow. They did that fast back then.
Yeah, and this was after a year of appeals. And actually, he's buried about 100 feet from my office in the Texas Prison Cemetery.
Wow! Do you go visit him then, or?
Yeah, I pay homage to him from time to time.
So what did you find out about him? Like, what was there anything special or different about him, or was he a pretty normal guy?
Well, the more I learned about him, the more he kind of fit into the psychopathy that you find with so many other serial killers, and I should say family annihilators as well. And and I found that there have been book chapters and things written about him, and even in the family records, I found most of what they had was misinformation, and I was able to kind of fix that through research through ancestry sites and archives and things like that. But what I found interesting was that he, went to prison at an early age, like 17, 18, for embezzlement. And for about 2 years, he was on all of the different farm units in Texas, turpentine farm, cutting sugar cane, all these miserable jobs. And I'm sure that didn't help his outlook on society. And by the time he got out, he was warning, all young people not to go to prison because you know what happens in prison. So he, didn't quite, get to the point, but I have a feeling that he was, physically abused quite a bit.
So his name is George Jefferson Hassell, right?
Right.
And so now, what was his situation when he was doing these mass murders? Was he working? Did he have a family? Did he? What was going on in his life?
Well, he pretty much was a laborer. He had different types of jobs, like working on an oil pump, working as a farmer. Just basically transient jobs, which you find with some mass murders and serial killers that move about. What makes this case so different is that he committed 2 mass murders, 9 years apart. And according to the FBI definition of serial homicide, 2 murders with a cooling off period makes him a serial killer. He also had a couple of murders in between, but here we have the murderer, multiple mass murder, serial murder, family annihilator. And one of the things I found that was interesting was that all of his, he didn't share DNA with any of his victims. He killed a wife and 3 stepchildren. Then he killed another wife and 8 stepchildren. And in between, he probably killed his last wife's former husband, who was his brother. And so I wrote to John Douglas and he told him, I said, could I call this guy a serial mass murderer? And he goes, yeah, I guess so. And he wrote a nice blurb for my book, by the way. He kind of fills a niche that not many people can claim to fill. 13 victims, 2 mass murders over a 9-year period. And there's probably other victims that we don't know about. He always kind of hinted at that.
Were there any signs of that he'd become a mass murderer in his childhood or teenage years?
Well, not really. I mean, he didn't have, he was beaten by his father, he claims. His mother was always smacking him around for violating biblical scriptures and that sort of thing. But he was out on his own in his teens. And he pretty much just, he had very poor impulse control, which often is a sign of, kind of a lack of prefrontal cortex activity in the brain. But he didn't plan for anything, what he was going to do for a job. And this, I guess, explains why he ended up in jail so many times. And he could never explain why he killed the families. He said with his first wife and the 3 kids, it was a common law wife, that we were just as happy as can be in bed, cuddling and everything. Then I grabbed her by the throat and strangled her. I can't understand why I did it. And then I decided I would go kill the kids as well. And they're little children in the next room. And over time, he came up with other explanations. He said the kids were getting on his nerves, and any parent can understand that. And also too, he thought she was stealing money from him. I mean, he's so full of these stories. It's hard to tell or substantiate some of his claims for stories that you find in this book. And he was living under an assumed name in California, and so. Right after killing the first family, he buried them under the house they were living in and told all the neighbors that they'd gone to Australia or San Francisco, depending on who he was telling the story to. And he stayed in the house. He would even bring other women there for a short period of time, knowing that they were down below, under the house. I think he kind of liked that. And even later on, he would drive by the house knowing the bodies were still, under the house and they had not been found. So anyway, he leaves the house, moves back to Texas where he was from. He was from the Fort Worth, Dallas area, born in 1888, same year Jack the Ripper was busy. And so he moved to his brother's farm, which was just in Oklahoma. And anyway, they had a big family. He was a farmer. He was relatively prosperous, for the 1920s. And the brother and George were in a corral one day, and the brother died being kicked by a horse. Well, George was the only witness, and you got to believe that he probably killed the brother. And then he decided he'd marry the wife, his former, sister-in-law, and take over the kids. And pretty soon, I think the neighbors were talking, and they moved to Texas and he lived under his own name. And, it was about a year later, one night he decided, she was complaining about his drinking. He always had alcohol out in the, in the barn. And a lot of journalists refer to him as the Jekyll and Hyde killer, and the alcohol was the potion that he took. Because before each of these murders, he apparently drank some alcohol. And she was complaining about that. But the worst part of his story, though, is he had sex and had impregnated 2 of his nieces who became his stepdaughters. And they were underage. One of them gave birth to a child. And, of course, that, went over real big. And she moved out. And she was the only child in the family to survive. But she moved to California with the baby. But the most recent person was a 15-year-old niece, and he had impregnated her. And the wife started hassling about the booze, and he just had enough. So he decided to strangle her and the 2-year-old that was laying in bed with them, and then just go room to room that one evening, and killing the rest of the kids.
And so nobody noticed, like neighbors or police or family or anything like that?
Well, the thing is that all the people, because he stayed there, he told them these cock and bull stories. They moved up to Oklahoma. They didn't like the school system here, this and that and this. And people began to wonder about it because they had seen 2 of his kids digging a pit near the house. And they didn't need this pit, like a storm cellar for storing goods, because they already had one. And his explanation before he was going to leave of why he filled it up was, we just didn't need it. When in actuality, that's where the bodies were all buried, like 10 feet from the house. And one of the things that happened is right before he left, he was a very greedy type of guy. He had a huge, he had an auction of all of his farm tools and, everything. And it was widely publicized. And he was working at the auction. You had hundreds of people there. And the auction was being held over the grave where his family was buried. And so anyway, a couple of the women that were there, they didn't believe what George was telling them, that they'd gone to Oklahoma and he was going to follow them. So they snuck into his house, basically, and they found a lot of gear that they would have taken with them if they had gone up to Oklahoma, children's clothes and toys and Bibles and things like that. And they reported all of these suspicions to their husbands, and they reported them to the local sheriff. And this was in Farwell, Texas. And they got on the case. They questioned him, and they were trying to figure out, well, if he killed them, and where would they be? And it was within a month they had discovered that the bodies were right near the house.
Wow. So I guess he was a pretty well-liked person then in the neighborhood, generally.
Well, he was very charismatic. The reason I titled the book "The Man with the Killer Smile" is because his smile was so disarming, and plus he had nice teeth. I mean, he looked like a commercial. He could do a commercial today with all the fake teeth. And he, like many serial killers, was very good at knowing what to say and when to say it. Knowing how to, disarm people, and hide his true nature. And, very glib. But he, ultimately had no empathy, no remorse. And he loved telling the story of how he killed them all, in many, many interviews that he would give, over the year before he was executed.
Wow. It's crazy. Did he have supporters?
No. Absolutely none. In fact, he tried to get a change of venue. But, he felt like, these murders were took place in Farwell, Texas. And, he needed 3 people to sign, these forms. And the only person that signed the form was him. And that wasn't enough. So obviously they had a trial there. And, but he was vilified, universally. And, people, of course, later on said they suspected this, suspected that, but, he was, a chameleon.
Well, he was in the military. What was his record like? I don't know if there was a record at the time, or, did he have problems in the military? How did that work for him?
Well, this is kind of an interesting aspect of his life too. So, on the spur of the moment, after, he joined the Navy, and then he deserted from the Navy very quickly afterwards. Then he joined the Army and deserted very quickly. And he did these under 2 different names. And then when World War I broke out, he tried to join the Navy again under his real name. And he got caught, and he ended up doing a couple of years for desertion and fraud at Leavenworth Prison and at a couple of the Navy discipline centers. It's not real clear, how much time he did, but apparently it was a very tough experience. These were, a couple of the toughest prisons in America. And, I think it just added to, his hatred for society, or his just not caring. But, I tried to find his record at Leavenworth. I couldn't find it. The only prison records I was able to get were, from Texas, from Huntsville. I got his records for when he was in for embezzlement and then when he was sentenced to death.
He looked like a pretty big guy. Was just from the pictures, was he, or is that just the?
Well, that's another interesting aspect. Every description, that you find in newspapers and interviews, they call him a giant of a man. I have his prison records, and it said he was just under 5'8", which would be maybe, average, for that time period. And that he weighed about 165 pounds. But when you see some of the photos, I have them in the book, his hands are enormous. And, he looked very muscular. His arms were long, very, almost like a primate. And, and he always had labor jobs. So, he was a pretty tough guy, but, the way he carried himself too, his head tilted back, he perhaps gave off the feeling that he was much bigger than he was. But he was finally, when he was in prison, they were describing him as he loved to eat. If you hear complaints from him, it's always about not having enough food and not having enough tobacco. And, it almost gets to be comical, when you hear these interviews with him, because he won't, do an interview with a reporter unless they give him a cigar or this or that. And while he was waiting in jail to be sent to Huntsville, he was making doilies, these beautiful doilies in his cell, and selling them so he could have money for tobacco.
Wow. Now, did he have any family left when he was in prison?
Well, this is another interesting aspect. I mean, originally I titled the book The First Texas Bluebeard. Because, as you know, a Bluebeard, marries and kills a sequence of wives. And this was the first guy ever referred to as a Texas Bluebeard. But the editors thought that, no one knows what the hell a Bluebeard is. So I went without it. But he did marry right after he got out of jail for embezzlement. And he had a child with the woman. And it was the only biological child that we know of that he ever had. And he always blamed her for him going bad. He said that she left him and that, he never loved another woman after that. And so she's the only one who escaped his clutches, essentially, because he killed his next two wives. But I did some research, and right before the book was, to go to the editors and everything, I was over at the archives in Austin, and I found a letter that was written 40 years after he was executed by his son, who had been left with the mother that is so-called abandoned him, and it turns out he said that they left because he was trying to kill them. And that kind of filled, that missing spot there. I mean, there could have been 3 dead wives. And I really, that was, a lot, again, not to overuse the term, but serendipity, finding that letter in all of these files.
Wow. Were his parents dead already?
Yeah. And, the interesting thing is he said they died much earlier than they did in all of his interviews. And I think he was trying to make it look like he was out on the road by himself much earlier. He said his mother died, the father remarried, and that the father's wife poisoned him. So he decided, and this was when he was still in his late teens, early 20s, he decided to go to where this took place and kill the family that had killed the father. And he got too drunk, he said, and, he just kind of missed his chance to do that. But that was the first inkling that he had this in him to do that. The problem with it is as I researched it, none of the dates matched. It's, the father lived much longer than, being so-called poisoned. There's no record of the father ever having another wife. So, a lot of it was just his embellishment. He had a very fertile imagination, that's for sure. Yeah,
it's always hard to trust people like that in what they're saying, because a lot of times they're just trying to manipulate something out of whoever they're talking to tell the story,
Right. And he had probably killed his only brother, but he had several sisters that were still alive, and they actually tried to help him in his last days. They even came to Huntsville right before he was executed, because they were trying to help him get an insanity defense and so forth. But it appears from early on that, he had left the family, and the family was pretty much glad about that.
Well, it sounds like it was a real big drama, his family and everything going on. It sounds like it was all out of control almost. But I mean, was that just maybe the times and where he lived? Was that kind of common? Was his lifestyle not that far off, or was it not very normal?
I would suspect that a lot of what he did was normal, except for, the killings and probably the serial desertions that he committed, which you can never, understand why he would do it like 3 times in a row. And, they're all, in pretty close proximity to, the time of each one. So he was definitely not a master criminal, if they even exist at all.
Yeah, what a strange story. So he got put to death then, eventually, right?
Right. And it's in the book I talk about the transition from hanging to the electric chair in Texas and in the United States, because in Texas they introduced the electric chair in 1924. and they replaced hanging. And before this, when people were executed, they were executed in the counties where they committed their crimes and where they were convicted. But this centralized executions in Texas, and they had to make a death row in Huntsville. It wasn't there before. And so he was one of the early people on death row, and he was on death row twice because they had to take him back and forth to the Panhandle for resentencing once or twice. And the electric chair, at that time period, was a pretty primitive looking device. And it was right down the hall from, the death row, so you knew it was there. The notion of the death penalty, back then was that, it was mostly African Americans that were being executed. In fact, the first time they used it in 1924, they used it on 5 black men in a row. And so they very rarely used it on white men. One of the interesting things I found too is they got rid of the gallows, all over Texas, in the counties, at the county jails. But in the county that Austin's in, the prisoners all wanted them to keep the gallows there, and they wanted permission to sleep on them. For some reason, I never quite understood that, but maybe because it was a nice wooden barrier support, and they could sleep higher up, and they just weren't allowed to sleep on where the trap was, where the bodies would fall.
What was his execution like? Did he have any last words or anything like that?
Well, he had kind of a couple of things to say. Basically saying that he was a lucky man, that he knew what his death date was, whereas everybody in that room, had no idea when their death would be. He expressed no remorse or anything like that. And there was a number of people, of course, that observed the execution, reporters and so forth. And he died bravely. I mean, there was no whimpering or anything like that, and he went pretty quick compared to some other people that had been executed. About a year or two before he was executed, a prison official allowed some of his friends to come with him, and they're all drunk, to go into the jail when there was an execution and witness it. And they were like teasing the guys being executed. It was a huge scandal in the newspapers and everything. It got so bad that the priest wouldn't even deliver last rites. And it was a pretty awful story. But this guy had the power to decide if they were going to watch the execution or not. Did
anybody see him get electrocuted then, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think there were 25 people in the room. And there was just there's like a bar that separates the spot where the person's executed. And the executioner is essentially the warden of the Huntsville Walls unit, because he's the one that gives a signal to pull the switch and, and deliver the electric power.
I thought you said there, I thought you were going to be a bar there so you could have cocktails and watch.
No, wasn't that type of bar. No. I mean, that's a good idea, though. I'm sure people would pay. I mean, executions used to be like that, where people would, people would be selling alcohol and food to see a public hanging. Another reason they got rid of hanging in Texas is because of lynching was out of control in that time period. And so there was too much of an association with the death penalty with extra legal or illegal lynchings on the outside. It was kind of a pejorative term, hanging, and they just went with the new technology.
Yeah. But it would have been pretty raw, like you were saying. So it was just like a chair that they strapped him up and give him a shot of electricity. I guess he probably tried.
Well, you want to see a picture of it? I mean, I have a picture of it if you want to see.
Did you put it in the book too, or no?
Yeah, it's in the book. This is the electric chair that was used.
Yeah, pretty raw.
That's the first electric chair in Texas. I mean, electrocution had been instituted in New York in 1890. So they were, kind of Johnny come lately. But
I wonder, how did they experiment to figure out how much they needed, or I wonder how they got it to where they had a system, a chair that I guess they just overblasted you? I don't know.
It was kind of experimental at first. In fact, the first person to be electrocuted in New York was a guy named William Kemmler. And they had to almost barbecue him because 3 times they gave him what they thought was sufficient jolts. And each time his heart was still beating. And by the time, he died, he kind of smelled like roasting flesh. And people were like, witnesses were vomiting, and, it didn't look good. In fact, someone said they shouldn't use the word electrocution. They should say he was Westinghoused to death. Because the electric chair was the product, and I'm sure you know this, of a battle for the electric current of America between Edison and Westinghouse. And one of the things Edison would do was he would travel around the country and show how dangerous AC current was, which was Westinghouse's current, electrocuting animals like an elephant and dogs and so forth. And, AC is much more economical than DC, and it won the battle of the currents ultimately. But Edison tried to portray it as being very dangerous and that, Americans shouldn't use it in the household. But, there's some science that actually went into, how many volts, to use before, the person was fully cooked. And there were a number of times when someone had to be, I guess, re-electrocuted. But for the most part, they had it down pretty well.
Wow. Now, were there family members of victims and stuff alive still, or anybody that was around to talk about that, or did they interview anybody about that, or did he just kill everyone?
No. I mean, the wife had a pretty large extended family, and they were the Fergusons, and they actually went to his trial and all of that. And one of the things they did is they wanted to ensure that he wasn't buried with, the good people of Farwell, and that he was buried a certain way, in which evil people are buried with the feet facing in one direction and the head in another. We don't know if this ever came to pass. But they were interviewed quite a few times. And one of the interesting things is I met a guy who was related to that side of the family, and he says he's writing a book, and I asked him if he'd share some of his research. He said no. But I found an interview he did, and he claims that George and his second wife were traveling around the country doing kind of bunco schemes, and he had been arrested for maybe killing someone in Chicago, early on. And I was never able to substantiate any of that. So I'm sure there's a lot, and I checked where he worked for missing people from the time periods that he was working there, like in the oil fields in California. He worked as a chef in the Merchant Marine. He had a whole bunch of jobs that he did, for very short periods of time. And I found photos in the newspapers from that time of him dressed up as a chef, dressed up as an oil field worker, almost like he's trying on Halloween costumes. There's always that smile and those long large hands of his.
Well, it's just a crazy story. It's not always easy to find good information for things back then too, like going through old newspapers and stuff. It's pretty inconsistent, as how I found it anyway when I did stuff.
No, I agree with that. And you typically have to check a lot of this newspaper stories, number one, against, other stories that you hear to see, where they're the same and see if they're all coming from the same person. But I tended to take interviews I found with people that had come across him, like his former employers, that he had stolen from, to try to help him in the early days. And, just other people that had come in contact with him, like when he was printing the auction information, he went to a printer in Farwell, and they're shooting the breeze with the guy and everything. And, they interviewed the person like 50, 60 years later. And the one thing this guy remembered is that Hassell was wearing the same type of winter boots that he was wearing when he came in, and he never wore these boots for the rest of his life, just as it reminded of him. So there's a lot of secondhand stories, and there. One of the things that was very helpful, I think, from this information my former student gave me, is his family. He had family members that went up to Farwell in the 1980s, and they were able to interview some of the last jury members from the trial, a couple of people that were actually involved in exhuming the corpses from from his farm. And so there was some information there that, I didn't find anywhere else. And some of it, I took as gospel to a certain extent, but I found that very interesting. And you got to remember too, is right after he was arrested and put in jail for this killing of his family in Farwell, he called the sheriff over in the jail and he said, this isn't my first rodeo. I killed another family back in California in 1917. And so, they didn't believe it. They thought it was just another case of his braggadocio. And he tried to explain where they could find the house. They were under the house. And he couldn't really figure it out, but, it got figured out. And they found the bodies. And in the LA Times, they had a picture of them digging the bodies out of this grave, the mother and the 3 kids. And so this wasn't discovered until 9 years later. Everybody thought they just disappeared, to Australia or wherever they were going.
Yeah, that's what they always say. Any surprises when you were doing the research? Anything that you didn't see coming?
Well, I got off on some tangents I didn't, expect to, get off on. Basically talking about, how people lived on the Great Plains and that sort of thing, and how rare crime was. And, I guess, the incestuous side of things. And I think the one thing that I found, since I still teach about serial homicide and mass murder, was the fact that when you have a family annihilator, family annihilation, family murder, it's more likely to happen, if it's step parent and step kids. And also the type of killing is much more up close and personal if it's a stepchild compared if it's a child that you sired. And, I found some different, comparisons. And until, I guess, trying to think of the guy in Arkansas that killed 14 families, Simmons, Gene Simmons, not Gene, Gene was his middle initial, but I'm sure the guy in Kiss would do it too. But this guy killed 14 family members. He had impregnated one of his children, and these were all biological children. He shot them all. So we don't see, the knives and the strangling and all of those that you see with George's victims.
So what's next? Are you going to do another one in the same sort of thing, or are you going to kind of go somewhere different with writing?
Well, I really enjoyed working on this book, and there's 2 cases that really haven't been covered a lot. One was a serial killer. I'm from Annapolis, Maryland, and I went to undergraduate school at College Park, Maryland. And the serial killer in the 50s and 60s, he's known as the Sex Beast, committed serial killings in Annapolis and College Park. And his name is Melvin David Rees, R-E-E-S, and I thought I might do some research on him. And then there's the another Texas Bluebeard. He was known as the Alligator Man of Elmendorf. I don't know if you've heard of him, but his name was Joe Ball. And he had like a kind of one of these bars on the side of the road near San Antonio. And he would hire these women, that he would find in, want ads and that sort of thing. And they'd come down there and he'd probably have an affair with them, and then they'd disappear. And as it would later turn out, he had pet alligators. And he would kill the women, apparently, and feed them to the alligators. And when the police, went to investigate him, he shot himself in the heart and killed himself. So he seemed like perhaps, another person. But I am actually working on 2 books right now. One's called Murder by Mail, A Global History of the Letter Bomb. And that's been a fun book to research. I'm about halfway through that. And this summer I researched the relationship between Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge at Fort Smith, Arkansas, and his executioner, which is a guy named George Maladon. And, I've started work on a book, The Judge and the Executioner, or The Judge and the Hangman, and seeing where that goes.
Wow.
So,
yeah. Do you ever get depressed?
No, not really. Yeah, I'm on the right meds.
Yeah, modern medication. Now, so how do you interact with readers and stuff like that? Do you do social media a lot, or are you doing a website? Where do people find you?
Well, to my detriment, I haven't been doing a very good job of it. And, I'll go down to Austin or Houston and, do a book signing at, one of the more reputable bookstores, if the book warranted, people's interest. But, I've left the marketing to mostly, my publishers and my different books, because I have publishers in England, and I've had, books published in China and, Turkey, et cetera, and they get marketed in those countries. But I've been pretty lousy at marketing myself and my books, and I'm going to make a website. I've decided for this particular book, and I've already lined up some talks, because it's just about to hit the bookstores this week. And I've just got to get better. In fact, maybe I can find some information from you, from the best, how to market.
Yeah, there you go. Dave's the marketer. He's
But then I'll have to hit Dave up.
Well, fantastic. I guess the pandemic, so it sounded like it was good for you.
Oh, I loved the pandemic. It was great. I mean, for flying, you had your own personal jet. I was actually, didn't mind it at all. I mean, because I fly a lot, and it never stopped me from flying. And for teaching, I didn't, have to see the students in person, and so I could teach online. I kind of like that as well. So, and I live a pretty solitary life, except for playing poker. And, it was great, except for poker, I should say. We couldn't have our poker group together anymore. So we put a game together on Poker Stars. So we all played together in one game online. But the pandemic, it's my son called it the boomer remover. He's 18, you see.
My.
And, so luckily nothing bad's happened to our family yet as far as that goes. And my mom got it, and she's like 94, and she, lived through it.
You just never know, how it's like anything, in life and what affects us and stuff like that.
The next one will be worse, I can tell you that.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that'll be the Gen Z remover.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Just, it's funny, but do you think that, but do things outside of, you have to be pretty, how do I say this? You have to be pretty steady to write this kind of crime and murder and stuff like that. So, but do things around you get involved in your writing and things like that? Like, because there's some really nutty things going on in the world, especially in the States, and a lot of stuff that happens, and tension and stress and all that. Does that affect your writing at all, or
not really? And nothing really bothers me, to be honest with you. And and I live in Texas, and so you gotta, look at that. If that doesn't bother you to begin with, you've got a strong constitution, and there's always strange crimes going on here. I've been doing a lot of TV interviews about that escape from the prison transport bus. I don't know if you heard about it a few months ago. And he's a Mexican mafia guy, and he got out. He was an assassin for the cartels, ends up killing a grandfather and his 4 grandchildren in their house. And that happened not far, from here. But you're always hearing about crime, gunfights in Houston and so forth. And I've had students that were homicide cops, and they would take me to homicides in Houston if I wanted. And so, for, little entertainment on a full moon, perfect night on a weekend, let's go out. Well, the funny thing is, too, is, I just, people that I've met before, and they'll say they don't like anybody who's morbid, and I try and sell myself as being someone who's not that morbid, and eventually I end up bringing them to the dark side to enjoy the stuff that I enjoy.
Great. You got any bodies in your basement or anything going on?
I've been asked that before, but the basement's been filled in.
So you're saying we'll never know?
No.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Okay. So now, did you have a website then or not?
No, I don't have a website.
Okay. So we'll have your book up so people can find you with one click. And, what more can we say? It's been great talking to you and about your new book. And we wish you the best. The book is called Man with a Killer Smile. And the guest, the author, Mitchel P. Roth. So thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mitchell.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me? Yeah. Good night. This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.